today we are talking about PR campaign, about how the PR campaign planning process provides a roadmap for communications, PR agencies, and others to execute successful programs and to measure effectiveness at the end. Joining me for this webinar are two communications leaders who will share their best practices. We'll end with Q&A. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the Zoom Q&A feature. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. First, we have Gemma Moroney, co-founder and behavior designer of SHOOK. SHOOK is an agency that combines behavior design and creativity to make ideas with impact. She was previously head of strategy at Engine Mischief and authored AMEC's Planning Primer Guide with Richard Bagnall and Jonah Burke, the precursor to their recently unveiled set of planning resources. And next we have Alex Judd, who as head of impact and planning at Clarity PR, blends the art and science of integrated communications. From boxing clever with startups to steering Fortune 500 conglomerates, Alex's principles of success remain the same: turning data into insights, insights into strategy, and proving the impact of the work that was delivered. And I'm Greg D'Andrea. I'm the Senior Director of Customer Success and Insights here at Onclusive. Now, for those of you who don't yet know Onclusive, we empower communications teams with media monitoring and PR analytics software and services. So today we are going to discuss how to plan powerful PR campaigns using data and analytics, something that's really close to my heart. Our recommendations are based on the frameworks developed by AMEC, the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. AMEC is the world's largest media intelligence and insights professional organization representing companies and practitioners. We'll end with Q&A. And as mentioned, you can submit your questions throughout this whole presentation by using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll address those at the end. So let's get started. PR campaign planning provides a roadmap for internal communications teams and PR agencies to execute successful programs. Without a plan, it's difficult to be on the same page in the beginning and to measure effectiveness when it's all done. Planning is not just writing a timeline. Planning is the discipline that represents the voice of the consumer. For PR, it's probably more helpful to say the voice of the audience. To include a number of publics and their influencers, for example, PR or public affairs may have an end audience, but also several audiences that they need to communicate with in order to influence that end audience. Planning is also responsible for defining the problem and goals, setting objectives, corresponding strategies, and for evaluating work continuously to identify those very important insights. So planning is a creative endeavor that is grounded by research and fueled by insight. It's crucial to creating more successful work because it defines the goals. But how do you make that leap from what you know from research to what the goals are and to what you need to reach and surpass those goals? So start at the end and define the why by answering two very important questions. Number one, what is the business impact that you're trying to achieve? And how can communications contribute towards that? And two, what is the problem you're trying to solve? So I'm going to start things off with my friend Gemma. As the author of AMEC's Campaign Planning Primer, Gemma, can you share some practices for defining the why in campaign planning?
Yes, absolutely, Greg. And I think the first thing is with why, I'd say think of it as why bother. So why should we be doing this thing? Because there is all sorts of, wonderful creative ideas and campaigns that you might do, and they might create a lot of noise, but are they going to actually have the impact that you wanted them to? Not necessarily. So as you said, what you need to do is, I would always suggest starting with the impact that the organization is actually looking to make. If you're familiar with the AMEC framework, what you want to do is think about the top left-hand box, which is about organizational objectives, and the bottom right-hand box, which is about impact, so that you're really clear from the beginning of your planning, what success is going to look like, and that you've defined the problem that you're trying to solve in order to achieve that success. So that problem might be a lack of awareness or a lack of affinity or a lack of action. And the other thing that I think is important to think about is, why is this so-called problem happening? And in fact, why has the problem been defined in this way? Because sometimes, certainly for agency people, you might be presented with a problem or an objective in a brief, but actually that isn't necessarily the real problem. So don't take it at face value. Think about what is the real problem and what's the right problem for communications to solve. And then I think once you're really clear on all those things, you can start thinking about the best way to influence the audience. So problem first, define the problem, and then start your planning. And I know, as you just mentioned, think about planning as representing the voice of the audience and driving effectiveness within the organization and the work that you're doing. It isn't just writing a plan or writing a timeline. It's that discipline of being the voice of the audience and driving effectiveness for the organization that you're working for.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I mean, really, the audience is key here. I think so often PR pros sometimes forget, what they're doing and who they're doing it for, and they just have the task that's been put in front of them. So I think that's really great advice. The AMEC integrated evaluation framework is a very useful planning tool to consider the problem that communications is tackling and the desired business impacts. It's common to get a brief asking you to increase share of voice by a particular percentage, or generically to raise awareness. But to create a meaningful plan, you need to understand the business imperative. For example, perhaps a service is actually looking to increase their subscribers. Knowing your audience, who they're communicating with, and who they're communicating to, and why they're communicating with them, that's all part of the key of things that you need to understand. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Alex and ask him his first question. Alex, what are your tips for defining your audiences?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think on that one, for me, the most important thing to remember is that your audience are complex human beings. They're not just demographics, a job title, an age range. There's so much more to you and I and everyone on this call as an individual person. It's the same with everyone else and your audience too. And so to bring that to life, there's a particular example that I really like. So let's say your audience persona, which is quite a fairly common thing in marketing circles. Let's say that looks like, that's been put as a pen portrait as someone who was born in 1948. They grew up in England. They have 2 children, they're wealthy, they've been married a second time, and they're really successful in business. Well, that could actually apply to Prince Charles, and it could also apply to Ozzy Osbourne. So you really do need to think beyond demographics. And what you need to focus on instead are their pain points, their motivations, and their desires. That's how you segment and define your audience. And you'll do that by blending attitudinal and behavioral data, which is typically gathered via surveys, with proper face-to-face interviews. So just speaking to 1 or 2 people in your audience for even just 10 minutes and listening, and really listening, is going to be so valuable in that process. So that's what I'd underline there. Obsess over your audience's pain points, motivations, and desires.
Yeah, and the demographics thing, right? I think we always target, it's so easy nowadays to target demographics and think that we've hit the mark. But to your point, you could be talking about 2 people like Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne who couldn't be more opposite. So that's a good point, Alex. AMEC's integrated evaluation framework provides a consistent and credible approach. Anyone can use it. It's free and non-proprietary, allowing any organization to benefit from its approach. It has been translated into 22 different languages and is taught in academia on multiple PR and communications courses around the world. If you can't measure it, it's not an objective. Meaningful, reasonable, and quantifiable objectives are at the heart of PR's value. A technique for understanding the problem you need to solve or opportunity that you want to address is the 5 whys. The 5 whys analysis, by repeating the question why after the initial problem or opportunity statement, each answer forms the basis of the next question, leading to a deeper understanding of the objective. So Gemma, Can you talk to us about the three intersections of the measurements and insights section of this wheel we're seeing here on the screen? 1, organization and stakeholder effects, 2, audience response and effects, and 3, measure activity.
Yes, absolutely. And the first thing to say is I think these are almost the flip side of your objectives. So it's a good place to start for setting them and for them making them smart, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it's a good place for thinking about how you're going to measure them. But actually, when I explain them, I'm going to go in reverse order from how you presented them. So I'm going to start with 3 first and work backwards. Because the first thing that actually a lot of people take as success is measuring activity or outputs. And, you know, we talked when we were preparing this, it used to be that sort of thud of a coverage book on a desk was, you know, job done, that was your success. And that's great, but that is not success. That's part of your journey towards success. So outputs, the things that you do within the activity, should not be the only thing that you think about. They're not your be all and end all. They're the first step on your journey towards impact. So these outputs should then lead to outtakes, which is what the audience understands, and outcomes, how it changes their opinion or their sentiment or their behavior. Those things are your audience response and effect. And then by impacting that, what you're doing is delivering against your organization or stakeholder effects, and that's your business impact. So think of outputs and then outtakes, outcomes as a chain working together to deliver that desired impact that you set right at the start of your planning. So they each contribute towards that journey. So it's almost like impact is your North Star, where you're getting to, and outputs, outtakes, outcomes are those steps on the way. Another tip that I think, you know, Alex touched on a little bit there is when you're thinking about audiences, I think maybe think about not just influencing one audience, but think about how you might influence one audience to reach another and then to have the impact desired. And I think that is one of the many reasons why it's worth asking those why questions that you talked about. So why isn't something happening now? Why isn't X audience doing something? Actually, is there another audience that we need to impact to make that possible? Or is there another audience that would have a big influential effect on them in order to help get us towards that impact that we want to achieve? And I know you guys are going to talk about those things in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I love how you mentioned the thud of the clip book on the desk. I mean, when I first got into this industry, that was something that we were really trying to push away from and saying, hey, you know, it's not just about how many articles or clips that you got. It's really more about what was the quality of that. And I think doing it in the way that you suggested here really gets to the heart of that and thinks about, you know, what do you really want to measure from an output standpoint? It's not necessarily just to quantify the quantitative numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Always got to go beyond that.
Yeah. So with clarity on your objectives and audiences, think about what you're going to measure starting with these 4 areas. So we're going to talk first about outputs. What you put out that is received by your target audience. The results are often in the form of media coverage, special events, collateral material, websites, and other channels. So that's outputs. Now, if we talk about outtakes, what audiences do and take out of your communication. They are shorter term and focus on your audience's initial responses in terms of attention, awareness, understanding, learning, interest, engagement, and consideration. Outtakes are achieved as a result of outputs. Outcomes are the effects that your communication has on audiences. So they are longer term, they're recognized in the form of attitude change, satisfaction, trust, preference, intention, and advocacy. Outcomes are achieved as a result of outtakes. And then finally, impacts. So these are the results that are caused in full or in part by your communication efforts. They are the effects that make a direct contribution towards the organization's goals and objectives. They relate to what happens as a result of the outputs, outtakes, and outcomes. So now that we have those 4, Alex, how do you think about the context of PR campaigns within these 4 areas in mind?
Yes, so I'd reiterate, there's a bit of a theme here, but you can see right at the top there, business impact goals. That's the thing to start with and to guide your process the whole way through. So it could be sales, it could be investment, it could be legislation change, whatever it is. Sometimes you'll be lucky enough to run a campaign that's significant enough to track that impact directly. But I think within the context of PR campaigns, actually often what we're dealing with, because PR is sort of a top of funnel activity, you're usually playing with outcomes. And that's usually as far as you can go to directly prove the impact of your work. So the long-term effects of a campaign. So that's a really good area to focus on. So what would you want to measure in that instance? Well, there I'd be looking to measure things that have been proven to have really strong correlations and causations with the desired impact. So, for example, I'd highly recommend measuring, if it's right for the certain campaign, a concept like mental availability, which is the ability for your audience to think of your brand at the time of purchase. And that's conducted through surveys and measured that way. And there's plenty of academic research out there that shows that mental availability heavily correlates and causates with increased sales and profits. So it's those kind of concepts that you want to seek out and measure. And again, you'll only really be able to do that by surveying a representative sample of your audience. But of course, going back to an output and outtake perspective, it's still really important to measure the quality of your media coverage and the effects it had within social media and search engines too. And actually search engines in particular, because PR can have a really big impact in the number of people searching for a particular brand or topic. And that's a really valuable action to look for. So it's that chain of things that gives you that full picture. And that's how you get to learn what's working, where you need to improve and tweak your execution accordingly, whether that's kind of a small tweak in your key messages or whatever that might be. But I suppose in a more simple form, I would say if you could have the answers to these three questions, you're in a really good place. So ask yourself, who did we reach and with what messages? What did they think as a result? And then what did they do as a result? And they're the three questions that are really going to guide you towards measuring the things that matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think don't leave the evaluation till the end, right? Always kind of be taking a measuring stick to things and how they're progressing. You'll need to decide how you will measure success early on in the campaign planning process. Remember that your leadership team wants to see metrics. That is number one these days. In God we trust. Everybody else bring data. So the metrics that we're talking about nowadays are website traffic, actions driven from other forms of return on investment. Think about how you will want to show that and how you will want to move strategically with your PR campaign and how that contributed to you meeting your communications and your organizational level objectives. I'll pause here for a moment so you guys can take a screenshot of this. Feel free to share it on Twitter and LinkedIn. Of course, tag Onclusive, AMEC, Gemma, Alex, myself, get all your hashtags going there. And I'll give you a second to take a screenshot of that. And of course, while you're multitasking and you're tweeting out some things right now, we do want to hear from you. So we're going to pop up a poll. Do you create strategic comms plans for your campaigns? Just take a moment to answer that poll, and we'll have the results a little bit later in this presentation. All right, so I think hopefully you've all taken the poll, and now it's actually time to dive into our true panel discussion here. And we're gonna kick things off with my friend Gemma. Gemma, as an agency leader, how do you plan successful PR campaigns for your clients?
Well, it will probably come as no surprise, Greg, for me to say that we start with organization objectives and desired impact. And I think a great quality in a planner or somebody that is at least acting as a planner, even without that name, is curiosity or being nosy. So often, in an agency, you'll get a brief and it won't necessarily tell you all of the information that you want. It might not outline those organizational objectives. It might not even necessarily talk about desired impact from a business point of view. So be nosy, ask. If the client doesn't know, go and look it up. It's often available, for example, in corporate strategies and corporate reports and that sort of thing. So if it's not there, ask, or find for yourself, improve on what you've been given, because you really do need to know where you are and where you want to go. And also you need to know how you will know that you got there and that what you did had the impact that you hoped it would, or that you set out to achieve. So it's really important to do those things at the very bottom as the foundations. Then, as I talked about previously, it's about defining the problem. So actually, what is the real problem? What is it you're trying to solve with communications that maybe only communications can do? What's stopping you at the moment? Then, of course, you need to build insight to really understand your audience in a way that Alex talked about, and also their influences, as I talked about on that circular slide. And then devise your strategy from that, your fastest route to your goal. And of course, a creative way to bring it to life. So yes, you need to do this kind of rational, serious bit, but also, in my opinion, at least, creativity is a superpower. So it's about then how do you supercharge all that kind of rational stuff that you've done with the more creative side of things.
Yeah, I mean, we're PR pros and communicators. We love the creative side of things. So that's actually a really, really good point. Alex, at what points during and after a campaign do you and your colleagues report on results?
Yeah, so obviously each campaign is unique, but typically we'll have 3 key moments. So straight after launch, no later than 24 hours, then a week later, then a month later. And each time you're adding more detail and more evaluation into those reports. Particularly when we're thinking about the definition of an outcome, the long-term effects of a campaign, you're going to need a bit of distance between launch. Sorry, it's my baby's bath time. I don't know if you can hear her screaming.
No
everything's
worries.
fine in my house. Like, nothing's going on. I wondered if this might happen. Apologies. Yeah, you need that bit of distance from launch in order to be able to measure the long-term effects of a campaign. So they're the big check-in moments. 24 hours after, a week after, a month, but increasingly across us at Clarity and across the industry as well, fully integrated digital dashboards are being used. So that's where you're able to draw all of that data and all your information sources into one place, whether that is through a bit of Google Sheets magic or whether you're directly hooking up to APIs, so the information feeds straight in. And that way anyone is able to just log in and check and see where things are at the moment. But yeah, you do need that kind of month after, at least, big evaluative report to really get the meaning out of it.
Yeah, it sounds like you really have a future communicator there, Alex.
Thank you.
No, I want to bring up a point though here that I think, we talk a lot about qualitative versus quantitative, and I think to your point around 24 hours after, then a week and a month, I feel like it wouldn't be wrong to say, hey, within 24 hours we can pull together a strictly quantitative report, our top KPIs, just to kind of get that out there and show direct and quick results, and then dive in over the next week or month and really provide some qualitative insights. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And because it's really important, if there'll be a lot of hard work that's gone into that campaign, people want to know what's going to happen right now. And, it's right to think that way. But you're absolutely right in terms of managing expectations there. If we're just doing a pure PR play, for example, you can show the number of media articles that were hit. You've probably tiered your media list, so you know which of those are actually important out of your target media, so you can add that in. You can automate things like key message pull through and sentiment, or if you've got the time, run through it yourself. So you're able to get some very good quantitative measures, but in terms of understanding really what's working and what could improve and what effects that had, absolutely right. That comes a week, a month later when we've got the time both to analyze it and the time for that effect to happen as well.
Yeah, definitely spend the time to dig in on those important nuggets. Gemma, to you, how have you seen communications contribute to organizational goals?
Thanks. Yeah, and I think it's important to say here, definitely I have seen communications contribute to organizational goals, and I'm sure lots of us have, and we shouldn't be afraid of saying that communication can and does contribute to organizational goals. I think, of course, it becomes tricky sometimes to measure it, and we talked when we were preparing this, I think there's almost this spectrum between if you have smaller brands or clients where you've got great transparency in terms of what's happening within the business, or actually very large clients that are really well geared up for insights and analytics and knowing which role each of their channels play, then actually that is relatively easy to do, particularly if you have a large client that invests in market mix modeling, which PR always seems to come out well on, by the way. It's sometimes more in the middle where it becomes more difficult. So yes, I absolutely have across a variety of different campaigns and organizations and objectives, and it's been, you know, things like brand consideration or increasing sales or encouraging people to positively change their behavior. But what I'd like to do is give you an example of a piece of work that we've been doing recently that I think shows that, but also demonstrates some of the principles that we've been talking through. And actually I'll try and answer one of the questions that I've seen within the chat as well. So we've been working with a charity called Adult Cerebral Palsy Hub in the UK. It represents adults that live with the disability cerebral palsy. So there are NICE guidelines within the UK, and that basically is an organisation telling the government and then the NHS how people with different health conditions should access their care within the NHS health service. Now, for adults with cerebral palsy, as children, they get great joined up healthcare. At the age of 18, that stops, and people describe it as their healthcare falling off the edge of a cliff. They can't access the joined up specialist healthcare that they need to manage their cerebral palsy. And the organisation had this great report that talked about the fact that if the NICE guidelines were adopted and this joined up healthcare was provided in the same way that's provided to other people with lifelong conditions, the economy would benefit to the tune of £422 million. And that's lots of kind of great rational information. And you think, well, why haven't they done that? It makes sense. Why is nobody taking notice? And to answer the point in the chat about insight, I think you can have an observation like, this is the way the world should be, this makes sense, but that isn't necessarily an insight. And just telling people the rational information and kind of the reason why it would make sense to adopt these guidelines isn't enough of an insight to get people to sit up and take notice. And actually the way that we thought about it when we read the report was, this actually feels illegal. It feels like discriminating against people with a disability versus other lifelong health conditions. And they said that, to Alex's point about going and chatting to people, it feels like their care falls off the edge of a cliff. So there's a gap. We feel that they're being treated like second-class citizens. So we came up with this idea of creating a set of 6 mock second-class stamps, which were featuring celebrities who have cerebral palsy, to draw awareness to the fact that people with cerebral palsy, because the guidelines haven't been adopted, are being treated like second-class citizens. And we petitioned the government to adopt the NICE guidelines. And on the back of the stamp, because we have a phrase, you know, back of a postage stamp, it was the world's smallest petition that just said care parity for CP, cerebral palsy. And what that has done is managed to achieve things that they haven't otherwise managed to achieve. Things like getting meetings with the right people, getting invited to be part of APPGs. So you can say absolutely that has contributed to their organisational goals, and it's done it because we knew that what we needed to do was impact, get the government to listen. And we did that by going out and talking to the CP community, to talking to the media, but we only did that because we knew what we wanted our eventual business impact to be. And we made it happen with creativity because we were able to find that insight about it feeling illegal and people being treated like second-class citizens and needing to stamp out the gap. So that was a long answer that I hope represents a lot of what we just.
No, that's amazing work right there. That is amazing work. And I think what resonates with me is, you know, really understand your organizational goals and objectives, right? I mean, I've walked into meetings with Fortune 100 companies where the comms team has no idea what's in the annual report as far as goals for the organization. And I think just understanding that and trying to match and align your communications goals with those really goes a long way to you really changing the narrative and really doing and accomplishing your goals from a communication standpoint. So an amazing example, Gemma. Alex, You're going to get the next one. What process do you use to set communications goals that are aligned with business objectives?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the 5 whys or the why ladder that we were talking about earlier, actually. Then it kind of works for both scenarios that you'll face. So the first is where you're starting with quite a tactical output-focused objective, like wanting a higher share of voice or more coverage. And you've got to ask yourself, well, why do you want more coverage? Maybe it's because you want to be better known and better respected, but why is that? What's the point? And you keep asking why until you get to that real objective. And similarly, we could be starting with the real meaty business objectives. You know, we want more sales. Well, why aren't you getting those sales right now? Is it because people don't just think of you, because they think your products are poor quality? You need to try and get to the root of that problem. And so either way, within that, we need to keep communications in mind. So typically we're dealing with concepts like awareness, consideration, preference, reputation. So when we're asking why, and we eventually need to land on that SMART objective, so SMART standing for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, we'll typically be setting our objectives around those concepts. So there's sort of that middle ground you want to meet between that proper business impact and that really kind of output, let's get more coverage piece, somewhere in between.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the SMART objectives, and I think in the years that I've been doing this, I can count on one hand how many of my customers were actually using SMART objectives. And just again, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely is what SMART stands for. And I think that's something that we probably all can do a little better at if we plan in that way. Gemma, which metrics do you measure and why?
Oh, it's $1 million question. It's going to depend on the organization and say that word again, the desired impact. And I think also your short-term goals. But the easiest way to work out what are the metrics that you want to measure is with that chain that I described. So I would almost start drafting it out, start with impact and work back through those other O's. And then you could almost kind of jot down what you think are the things that might go into each box. So in terms of outputs, you know, what are you, maybe you're looking for, you know, coverage, or you're looking for endorsement from influencers, or you're looking for a number of people at an event, or whatever it is. And then keep doing that within those boxes to kind of do a first draft. But always think about that chain. So the outcomes, the outputs are saying this, which is making people take something out of it, which is making something change, which is an outcome, which is leading to the business impact. And I think then what I would do is look at what you've got already existing in terms of an ability to measure certain metrics and where you might have gaps. And then, of course, what I would do is make sure that your objectives are SMART and ideally benchmarked and tied to that desired impact. So I think if you get your objectives right and you get your outputs, outtakes, outcomes, impact right, they go together as a package.
Right. So it's not always the same KPIs that we want to look at, right? It all depends on what our goals and objectives are. And to your point, you mentioned marketing mix modeling before, and I think that PR is starting to get a seat at that table more and more now. We're providing something there from a data standpoint. And that's something you need to think about as well. You know, what works for you in that data stream. So yeah, that's great. Alex, we're going to toss you the last one here. Post-campaign, do you typically segment your measurement by audience? And if so, how?
Yes, it's certainly something you can do. If you're targeting multiple audiences with the same campaign, it's likely you will actually have a set target media for each, and probably a different set of key messages as well. So you can segment your measurement by audience using those two factors, media title and key message inclusion. You may also be able to use social media profile data or the language they're using on social, perhaps, to distinguish between those audiences, or what they're searching for in Google. But those two can be quite challenging depending on how distinct your two audiences are and the different ways that you're communicating to them. But of course, if you're surveying your audience pre and post the campaign, then segmenting is pretty easy through the qualifying questions. But I'd just say I wouldn't walk before you can run. I think if you can answer those 3 questions I brought up before, who do we reach and with what messages, what do they think as a result, and what do they do, then you really are onto a winner from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's whenever I've helped roll out global campaigns or programs for customers, it's always, crawl, walk, run. You don't want to
Yeah.
try to do it all at once. All right, so it's about time for getting to your Q&A, but before we do that, Eric, did we have a results to our, there you go, results to our poll. So it looks like sometimes 48% of you are creating strategic communications plans for your campaigns. Those 15%, hopefully we have changed your mind so far on this call, and always great, keep it up. That is good to see. All right, it's time for our Q&A period. Thank you all. I know you've been sending. I just had a glance at the chat, and you guys did ask a lot of questions. So we'll hopefully get to some of them. And I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll start with one that was actually submitted in advance, and this is going to go to you, Gemma. This is a multifaceted question, if there ever was one, but I'm going to give it to you. What are best practices for A, identifying KPIs and measures for PR campaigns? B, collecting and monitoring analytics. C, evaluating the success of campaigns using analytics. And finally, D, determining next steps, actions based on analytics.
I'm so glad that you gave me a heads up on this question, because otherwise I don't think I would have remembered past B. So thank you. So it's an absolutely huge question, because it has, apart from anything else, 4 parts to it. And it's going to depend on a number of things, but I think I would say start with the AMEC framework and plot out what you know already. So whether that's from client data or research or external partners, and then think about what you need to know to really understand the position that you're in now. Ideally, if there's an in-house insights team, either at your agency or even better, client side, make best friends with them. They are very much your friend. And they will give you a wealth of amazing stuff that you wouldn't get otherwise. Then you can assess where you are and where you want to get to in terms of impact and the best way to do it. And around that, you can then pick the analytics and data you already have to use, to measure success, and then see where you might need to plug some gaps. So maybe you might need to go and speak to another part of the organization to find something out, be able to use their data. Maybe you might need to look for a partner to measure something that you haven't measured in the past. As we've talked about during this, ensure that they're linked to your SMART objectives, that they're benchmarked, and that they're linked to those steps within the AMEC framework. As Alex talked to, make sure that you can measure them in real time, because it's no good getting to the end and then saying, oh, that didn't really go as well as we thought it would. And there are always these odd nuances within campaigns, that there's something that you thought would fly and it doesn't, and there's something that was a smaller part and that's what goes, absolutely gangbusters. So it's really good to be able to review how it's going and optimize in real time. And I think that's the sort of final important point, is it isn't just about measuring and metrics, it's about evaluating. So measurement is scoring and evaluation is improving. I stole that from Richard from AMEC, by the way. I have to say that in case he is listening or something. It's about working out, where you can improve next time at the end, but also where you can improve whilst the campaign's in flight. And I think the other thing is, over time, you will start to understand more and more. So for example, a client that I used to have, they had, actually, we were lucky, a great in-house insights team and a great measurement system in place. So it meant that we had overall benchmarks for the whole organization. We had benchmarks for certain campaigns that had been done year on year. We could measure things like for like, and then we could also see what good looked like, not for an industry average, but for that organization. So what does a good quality audience reach look like for a campaign for that organization, or a good view through rate for a piece of content, or what does engagement look like as good for that organization? And I think then you can become more and more bespoke over time.
Yeah, I mean, that was a comprehensive question, and Gemma, I don't think anybody could have answered it any better than you just did right there. We are going to get to some of these other questions. I think I have a few up here. I think one good one is, do you think message pull-through can be evaluated using only algorithmic-based software tools, or does it really require human review? So either Gemma or Alex, any of you want to take that?
I would say, yes, to an extent, but I think we've probably all seen instances where you just know that it doesn't feel quite right. So I would say yes, but you probably do want to apply a bit of a human lens over it, whether that's in reviewing it and making sure that it feels in line with almost your perception of it, or whether that's using the two in tandem to just make sure that things are checked and as you imagine. I don't know if Alex want to add to that.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think machines and machine learning is getting better and better, but yeah, things do slip through the net, particularly with sentiment, but also to a certain extent, key message pull through as well. So I would say you would want to, you know, cast a human eye over probably the most important pieces of coverage that you've got. But yeah, and you'll know every tool is you know, has its own kind of unique quirks, and some are better than others. So by being quite critical, first of all, you'll learn where you can trust it or not. But I would probably always keep, you know, a human eye over those most important pieces of coverage, just in case. But certainly if you're doing like, you know, 1,000, 2,000 pieces of coverage, the fact is usually any errors within the software are usually ironed out. It's kind of like a football cliche where it all comes out on the wash, like over the course of the season. You know, if you've got that much data, it actually all ends up kind of being all right. But yeah, I would go the same as you, Gemma, with a bit of human intuition there as well.
Yeah. Carlos asks, how many KPIs do you recommend to include in each campaign, and how many metrics do you suggest including on a report? Now, this is similar to what we were talking about. No one KPI fits everything, but does anybody want to take a stab at, you know, how many? Is there a specific limit? Should we kind of limit ourselves to certain KPIs, or is it really just the ones that make the most sense based on what we're doing?
My gut feel is, I'm going to say something potentially controversial, which is, in a way, I think you should probably only have one KPI, and the KPI is linked to the business impact. But you know, you might need a few more than that. And then I think, again, if you think about the AMEC framework, outputs, outtakes, outcomes, impact boxes, so I've covered impact. With the other three, I think probably, and again, it's going to depend on what the campaign is, what the objective is, what the desired business impact is, but I would say you probably don't want more than 3 or 4 in each box, because otherwise it's just starting to get confusing. And is it telling you any more by adding more things in? You know, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that you should. I think the other thing to think about is your audiences, as in your client audiences, or if you're in-house, your colleague audiences. You know, C-suite is not going to want to know, you know, your 15 different metrics. They probably don't care. They probably only care about that KPI towards the end of that chain.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think 3 is the magic number for each channel. It's funny when we get into the sort of semantics of this area, I think, because you know, KPI, objective, and goal, they all sort of become a little bit interchangeable, and there's probably a job to be done there, I think, in nailing down exactly what means what. I tend to view KPIs as the individual channel kind of goals that you would ladder up to, and the objective being the communications objective, to try and distinguish between that. But I think, you know, I think it's an interesting thing that's highlighted in terms of the language we're using around goals and targets and KPIs and just about everything else. But totally agree with you, Gemma. The magic number's 3 for each of those, but the one that really matters is that comms objective at the top.
Planners will always go for 3. It just looks good. 3. Unless it's a percentage question, and then it'll be 10%.
Speaking of 3 KPIs, we have a question here around how do we specifically demonstrate PR impact on brand awareness, and then they mentioned sentiment, web traffic. Do you guys have any insight to share on that?
Yeah, so particularly something like web traffic, you know, you can do that through correlations and causations. For example, you can map out on a graph fairly easily, showing, you know, what coverage has appeared when, and then web traffic corresponding to that as well. And particularly you can do that within branded search as well, who's searching for the brand at that time. And then, of course, if nothing else, no other marketing activity was going on during that time, and there's a big spike when you've got that coverage, great, that's directly attributable. And a brand, you know, things like awareness can be measured through branded search as well. I know share of search has been a metric that's been talked about a lot. Recently published a paper with the PRCA under the innovation group called Beyond Share of Search, all about that as well. But it's shown that the number of people searching for your brand divided by the number of people searching for all of the brands within your category, that has a direct correlation with market share. So it's not just, it's awareness, but kind of goes beyond that. But in terms of beyond, you know, just search, you want to be a little bit careful with social and having that as your de facto sentiment around the brand. Not every one of your target audience is going to be that vocal online and is going to be, you know, shouting what they feel all the time. However, it is a good indicator because the best way to do it is through surveys, and sometimes you may not get that investment. So just caveat that. But yeah, surveys are the best way to do it. If you're doing pre and post campaign, really easy because you've obviously made that impact. If you're doing it biannually or annually, you can, that's where it can get a bit tough because you can ask people at that point, you know, have you read about brand X in the media in the past 6 months or however long it's been. But obviously with those kind of time frames, it becomes difficult for people to self-report. Oh yeah, I remember that article I read about them 5 months ago, and put their hands up and say that they have. So yeah, as with anything, there's lots of, it depends, but there certainly are ways to attribute that. What do you think, Gemma?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything that you've said. I think it's trickier nowadays, but certainly on campaigns in the past, we had examples where we were able to look at and compare web traffic from PR coverage versus from Facebook advertising. And actually what we found was Facebook advertising drove a greater volume of people, but they didn't necessarily hang about on the site for too long, whereas people that had come through reading editorial coverage is almost of a sort of I guess sort of self-decided that it was for them, and they would stay on the site for longer, explore more pages, etc., etc. That was a behavior change campaign, so actually that was a really good thing to have people going to the site and spending time there and looking around. The other thing I would say is it obviously depends sort of how much money you've got, but if you have got money for things like brand tracking, so in the UK, YouGov, for example, is somebody that might do that, and there are obviously sort of other options. I think that's well worth looking at. So the brand consideration increase that I mentioned at the beginning, that was how that was measured, and there are opportunities for looking at how PR has contributed to an uplift in, you know, desire to buy a product, for example, within the wider mix, that I think are really interesting, obviously expensive, but interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are several tools out there to track traffic back to your website, especially if it's coming from earned media. Onclusive is one of the ones that has that. So I definitely, if that's something that's important, and I think it should be important now as we move more into qualitative KPIs, definitely have a look around and see what makes sense there from a standpoint of your goals and objectives.
I think it's also for, sorry, Greg, for when you're planning in the first place, it's interesting. So for example, a charity client, often you would find that, you know, no surprises, The Guardian in the UK would be very effective at people clicking through from a link on that site and making a donation or supporting the cause. And if you know that from previous campaigns, then you start with how are we making sure that they're part of what we're considering. So I think, yes, for measurement and evaluation, but also for at the beginning.
Yeah. Have you ever had a client ask you to enhance, that's the way it was, enhance the results of a campaign, even though they were successful results? And how did you handle that?
I saw this in the chat, and the answer is no. And I found it odd that it was, even though they were successful, they'd asked them to enhance the results. So no, not in that scenario, and also not in a it wasn't successful scenario. And I think it's a good opportunity to make the point that I know Alison Spray, who worked on the new planning resources for AMEC with Alex and others, has tried to make a lot, which is you shouldn't be afraid of admitting when things haven't gone as well as you'd hoped, because there's an opportunity to learn from it. And I think sometimes, you know, sometimes things don't go as well as you'd hoped that they would for whatever reason. And it's not necessarily because the strategy was bad. It might be because it just didn't go well executionally, you know, during the period of the campaign or whatever it is. And I think it's important to look for the things that didn't go so well as much as to celebrate the things that did go well.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And I think that you've got to think about, I mean, the ethics of it, first of all. And within that, I would probably underline, I know it's difficult if you've got, you know, bills to pay, a mortgage over your head and stuff, but there are people that you'll want to work with and people that you don't, and people who are going to ask you to quote unquote enhance or essentially lie about the data. If that's, you know, if that's something that quite rightly so you have an issue with and a problem, then they're not people you want to work with. You know, you want to work with people. There are lots and lots of good people out there that want to do good work and want to be honest and will listen to your you know, your consultation and your advice out there. So I would keep that in mind as well.
Gemma, I know you pretty much outlined a campaign that was very successful, probably using SMART objectives, but do either of you have another example of a SMART objective?
Yeah, sorry, so we're both waiting for each other. Did you want to go ahead, Gemma? Sorry.
Oh yeah, so we have, for example, we used to work with, when I was at Mischief, we worked with the National Trust charity, and a campaign that they had every year was their 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4, which is designed to help get kids to connect with nature, because if they connect with nature when they're young, they have a lifetime connection with nature, which is important for the charity, but also very important for their health and well-being. And so a SMART objective for them would be things like increased web traffic. So it might be a 30% increase in traffic to the website during the campaign period, and also things like app downloads. So then you know that people are doing the list of 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4. So it might be, you know, a 50% increase in app downloads. And actually, one year for that campaign, it was a 500% increase in app downloads.
I think, and just to add onto that, Gemma, I think the great thing about that. I should have added
time during the campaign to make them timely.
Yeah. Oh no, I was going to say that, you know, when we're talking about 50% or 30%, those are, remember the achievable. They're achievable because, you know, you would have looked back and you would have said, well, we know based on previous activity and whatever else happened, 30% is a really good result for us, and it's also going to be achievable for us. And so that's how you set those kind of percentages. Not necessarily, you know, if you really don't know, then you start at the beginning. You don't set that specific number and you wait and see what the first campaign does if you're starting on your journey, or you set it but you caveat it very heavily, saying, look, this is based on industry benchmarks. We're starting our measurement journey here. This is what we think, but we're not quite sure if it's achievable yet. And you get everyone on the same page. But yeah, I think that's a really good example.
I think we got time for one more here. And this, I want to ask this question that I saw come up here in the chat, because I feel like, I mentioned it during the panel discussion, that, you know, I don't think communications folks typically marry communications objectives with their organizational objectives. And so the question that was asked was, how do you marry communications objectives with organizational objectives? And there could be some pretty obvious answers there, but I wanted to see if you guys had any good response that I might not be thinking of right now.
I'm going to try and think of an example for you on the fly. So I think the way that I would think about it is, what does the business want to do? And then how can communications help be part of an effort across the whole of the activities that the business is doing, whether it's, I don't know, how their customer experiences and staff treat you in a shop, or what they're doing with experiential activity, whatever it is, how are all those things pushing in the same direction to achieve that organizational objective, and what can communication specifically do really well to be able to achieve that. So if I give you an example of working for a holiday company, obviously they want to increase sales. They want growth, they want to grow. And it was a well-known holiday company within the UK that had been the creator of the category, but had slipped down the pecking order in terms of consideration. And when you choose a holiday, you typically only look at, say, 3 brands before choosing. So if you're not in that consideration set, then you're not going to book a holiday with them. So our role for communications was increasing consideration, because a holiday is a bit like a car. It's quite a lengthy, expensive process. So what can we fundamentally feel that we can really have an impact on in communications? Well, that's consideration, which was tracked with this YouGov study that I was talking about. We did it through an integrated campaign, working with a couple of celebrities, and basically because there wasn't actually anything that particularly differentiated this brand from its competitors, in order to increase consideration, they're all pretty similar. What we did was take a category truth, which was around all-inclusive holidays and how they make you feel like you're rich, basically, because you never have to say no. You can have drinks, you can have activities, you can have excursions. And then we created a campaign owned by the brand around that category insight and truth that helped to increase consideration for the brand. And it did actually have an impact on sales as well, but that wasn't what we had tasked ourselves with. We tasked ourselves with increasing consideration.
Awesome. That's great. Well, listen, I think we've come pretty close to the end of time here. Thank you all for the wonderful questions. If we didn't get to your question, I believe we will be answering them all anyway after the fact when we send you the recording. But thanks to everyone for joining us. Much appreciation to our panelists, Alex and Gemma, for sharing their experience and insights. We'll be distributing the recording of the webinar to all the registrants within 24 hours. If you have any other questions or want to learn more about Onclusive, feel free to email us at info@onclusive.com. Have a wonderful day, everyone.